Welcome to the CRS training module on preparing for your CRS verification visit. We'll begin with the document you'll want to refer to for current guidance in the program, the 2017 CRS Coordinator's Manual. You'll notice it expires March 31st, 2020. Throughout this webinar, we'll cover the basics of CRS, scheduling the visit, the different types of visits that we have, the requirements that everyone needs to meet before the visit, and some of the different things we can do prior to the visit. We're going to talk about the visits themselves. I'll show you some example documentation, just focusing on some of the more common activities that we do. We'll also cover what happens after the visit and the expectations of both parties once the visit is done. And lastly, we'll give you some tips and tricks for making your verification visit as successful as it can be. Remember, we're talking about that 2017 Coordinator's Manual. If you need a copy, it's available on our website, crsresources.org. Once you're on the home page, there's a link to the Coordinator's Manual right in the middle of the page. And when you click on that, you're going to see a couple of other things you can find: the master list of elements, the crosswalk between all the credits, and the summary of changes between the previous manual and the current manual. Remember, our website is crsresources.org. Okay, let's begin by talking about scheduling the visit. Generally, your ISO CRS specialist will contact you in January if you're due for your cycle verification visit that year, to give you a heads up or to ask what time of the year is best for a visit. And then you'll be contacted again at least 3 to 4 months prior to when the visit is actually going to occur. Usually we like to give you plenty of notice in order to prepare for a visit, and we'll find a mutually effective date between your specialist and you. At that time, you'll be sent what we call our crosswalk, which is, if you're in the program currently, and this is your cycle verification, you're going to get a list of all the activities that you received credit for previously, and then the documentation requirements for each. So that helps you prepare for your visit. And generally, you'll receive that at least 3 to 4 months or so before the visit. Now let's talk about the different types of visits. We have cycle visits. That's the full verification of all your activities and all the documentation that determines your classification. Communities are either on a 3 or 5 year cycle schedule, depending on your class and the amount of discount you are providing your residents. We also have modification visits. Let's say you're on a 5-year cycle schedule. You do not have to wait until your next cycle verification to change your class, if you believe you can do so. At any time during those 5 years, go ahead and contact your CRS specialist, and we can do what's called a modification. If you're improving a class, we just look at the new activities that you want credit for. This process does not look at all your existing activities, just the new ones to reach that next class. We also have a new application visit. As it implies, if you are joining CRS, this is essentially the same type of visit as a cycle visit, meaning we'll go through all your activities and all the documentation to see what classification you'll get. And new in the last couple of years is what we call a remote visit. If you're a Class 8 or 9, if you haven't changed CRS coordinators in a while, if there isn't much development in your floodplain, and you're doing the same activities you've been doing for the past cycle or two, we can do your cycle visit over the phone. Many of our modifications end up being phone visits as well, where we discuss the documentation that's required, and then have you send the information to us. The remote visit works the same way, except we can use it to verify your entire program at cycle time, assuming your community meets all the criteria I mentioned earlier. And remember, these visits are just for Class 8 or 9 communities. Next, let's talk about preparing for the visit. First, when you get the crosswalk, you want to review it, look through all the activities and the documentation that's required, and develop a plan of attack. Think about what other staff needs to be involved and included in scheduling. Think about which activities you want to concentrate on. We highly recommend that you work ahead of time. Do not wait until a week or so before your visit. You can submit documentation to your specialist in advance. This makes the meeting go a little easier. You're not bogged down going through documentation the whole time. You can discuss the activities and possibly see if there are changes you can make for more credit, or get further guidance from your specialist on those elements you aren't clear on during the meeting. Many communities have started doing this, and we've seen lots of success. We know you're busy, and for most CRS coordinators, the CRS is not their only job. So working ahead of time allows you to work on it bit by bit when you have time to spare, and not have to scramble and submit documentation in the short time frames after the visit. Here's an example schedule that we built for a fictitious community. You see, we try to get the program prerequisites, the elevation certificates, or ECs, and repetitive loss requirements done first. That way you know you're able to stay in the program and continue. Then we look at the elements that need more technical review. This is where we send the documentation to our experts for them to verify. This can take a little time, so it's good to get those submitted at the beginning of the process. But there are 2 activities where we do need documentation 60 days ahead of time. The first is Activity 310, which is your permit list and your ECs. The permit list should show all the new and substantially improved and substantially damaged structures in your 100-year floodplain since the last visit. Your list should go back to your previous cycle visit date and must include the permit number, the issue date, the address, the type of building. Is it a residential or commercial building? Is it new or substantial improvement? What firm zone it's in? And do you have the finished EC for each? We have a template on crsresources.org under the 300 Series tab. Look under Activity 310 for a template with columns for each of these permit list items. The template is not mandatory to use. You may use your own way of tracking things. Just ensure that your system covers the same columns of information so that we know we're getting the correct ECs and you don't spend time tracking down ECs that we don't need. To repeat, we only need to see ECs for new buildings or those substantially improved or substantially damaged in the floodplain. And keep in mind, only insurable buildings should be on the list. So the utility sheds in the backyard, swimming pools, fences, fill or cell phone towers, those kinds of things we don't need ECs for. When submitting your ECs, place them in the same order as they are listed on the permit list. This really helps our reviewers. You'll want to send in all the certificates that are required, not just ECs. In certain cases, V-zone certificates or floodproofing certificates for non-residential buildings are required as well. Also remember to submit the engineered flood vent certificates if the building used engineered flood vents. Once we receive your ECs, we'll review them for completeness and accuracy. In order to stay in the program, at least 90% of your ECs must be filled out completely and accurately. Your score for this element is based on the first time we review them. Whatever percentage is correct will be calculated into your score. If you don't have 90% correct at that time, we'll send them back to you and say, okay, here are the ones that have mistakes, and you'll need to correct them up to the 90% standard in order to stay in the program. You will have 3 chances to do that, and if 90% don't pass after the 3rd review, you'll be recommended to be removed from the program. This now brings us to our new centralized review program that we have. We have 2 resource specialists that review all the ECs at recertification time and at cycle time. You'll still work with your local ISO CRS specialist to develop the permit list and ECs. Then they'll pass them on to the resource specialist. Once reviewed, the resource specialist will send you a report saying which ECs are correct and, if any, which ones have mistakes. Then you will work directly with the resource specialist if you're not at the 90% mark. And your CRS specialist kept in the loop the whole time. Here's a tip for submitting your ECs. If you're scanning them, try to scan them at 300 dpi and grayscale. This is because we send them through an optical reader software, and it reads them best when they're submitted this way. The second activity that's required ahead of time is Activity 540, Drainage System Maintenance. We'll need all the documentation listed here for the most common element, which is CDR, Channel and Debris Removal. So you'll need your written procedures, inventory and map of your system, inspection and maintenance records, and the signed Community Certification EHP form. All of that should be submitted ahead of time. We ask for this ahead of time because for some communities, their drainage system may be large and complex, making for quite an involved review. Once your CRS specialist sees your inventory and map, they'll tell you which inspection records to send. Okay, let's get into activity documentation. We'll start with the Community Certification 230 form, or CC 230. On this form, you will fill in your community and map information, population, and also mark the activities that you're requesting credit for. Make sure this form is signed and submitted. There's also a program data table. When this is the first time you're verifying under the 2013 or 2017 manual, You will only need to fill out the fields highlighted here in yellow. Once you've been through a cycle visit since 2013, you'll need to fill out all the fields in lines 1 through 15 that apply to you. If you have a regulated floodplain, you'll need to fill out column B. Column C is optional. Also be sure to fill out the period covered and your current firm date at the bottom of the form. Let's get into Activity 320, which offers credit for the map information service you provide on firms and other flood-related map information you give residents when they call in. Like any service you provide in CRS, you must publicize it and must track it or document it. So the 320 map information log is one way of tracking. These red MIs shown across the top of the screen are the 7 different types of map information that you can get credit for under this activity. So examples of being able to tell a customer if they're in a floodplain or a wetland, or if the property has been flooded before, or those sorts of things are shown in your log. So on the log, we want you to show those map information elements. Besides documenting the service, you need to publicize it. For example, the blurb on the left-hand side is taken out of a letter sent directly to all residents. And then you have to show how you know this information, and that's usually through mapping. The example to the upper right shows MI6, rep loss properties. And that's where flooding has occurred in the past, so this covers MI6, which is credit for historical flooding information. So just show us how you know the information. Make sure you mark up your documentation thoroughly, showing us where each MI1 through 7 are at, so that it's easy enough for your CRS specialist to follow, and we don't overlook it and miss credits for you. Activity 330 is outreach. All kinds of outreach that goes to any audience is creditable under CRS, as long as it covers at least one of the 6 topics. Just make sure you tell us how often it goes out, who the audience is, and show us a marked up copy of your outreach projects showing where the topics are covered. In order to get credit for covering a topic, you have to have an action statement telling the reader what to do or not to do. Without an action statement, no credit will be received. Activity 350 is your library and website credit. This chart on the left shows the 9 publications from FEMA that you get credit for under LIB. Under LPD, locally pertinent documents, here are examples of other documents that you can have in your library and receive credit for. Basically, it works for any flood-related publication that is locally pertinent. Remember that they have to be cataloged, so we'll need some kind of proof of that, either a printout from the library's online catalog or a letter from the library verifying that they are cataloged. Also under 350, we have website credit for floodplain management information you have on your website. Credit is earned by covering the same 6 topics as Activity 330, but keep in mind you don't need the action statement in 350, just the information. Activity 360 is another common activity. It's a service where you can help anybody that calls in and has water or flooding problems on their property. You can help them understand what is causing the problem and how they could fix it, so it's a service. For publicizing it, you need to make sure it's sent at least to all floodplain residents, if not everyone in your community. It can also be covered in an outreach project that is part of a PPI, a program for public information. There are lots of different ways you can document it. You can keep a log, maybe a memo to the file every time someone calls, or if you conduct a site visit, any kind of internal database system that you have for tracking that sort of thing. We also need to know the technical qualifications of the folks that are providing the service, usually a building official, a PE, or a CFM. If it's someone other than that, we'll need to review that and have you briefly explain why they're qualified to provide the service. For Activity 420 Open Space, the 2 big pieces of documentation you'll need is a list of all your open space properties, such as what's seen on the left-hand side of the screen, and then a map of the properties which corresponds to that. When you make the list and map, please label them with numbers or letters so that it is easy to find the information for each property. In the example of the list on the screen, they're labeled 1, 2, and 3, and then you can look up number 1 and see that it is clearly identified by the number 1 on the map. Remember, the map needs to show not only the open space properties, but also the floodplain, so you can overlay the 2 together and make sure that the open space properties you're requesting credit for are inside the floodplain. Activity 420 may also require other documentation. If your properties are considered open space because of regulations or laws, we'll want to see what those regulations are. If you're getting additional credit for properties that are deed restricted, we'll need to see the deeds for DR credit. And if you're trying to get the extra credit for properties that are in their natural state and providing natural functions, that's NFOS 1. We'll need a letter from a professional biologist, forester, or landscape architect, someone with expertise in that field. Activity 430 is your higher standards for floodplain development. For this, please send in a copy of your ordinance and note where the creditable elements are. For example, you'll want to show where you're requiring freeboard, or if you're tracking cumulative substantial improvement, show us where that's at in the ordinance. You'll also have to provide permit records to show you enforce each provision. Activity 440 is for additional map data. This is typically your flood-related layers in your GIS. In this example, you'll see the AMD markups. Please identify those areas and elements in the printouts you send so that we can make sure you're receiving credit for the appropriate layers. Activity 450 is Stormwater Management. Since we're dealing with regulations, this is very similar to Activity 430. Here, we'll review your stormwater ordinance, so mark up the elements you're seeking credits for. At minimum, identify the size of development regulated and the design standards for stormwater facilities. If you have erosion control and water quality standards, please mark those as well. We'll ask for drainage calculations for the SMR elements and site plans or permit records for erosion control and water quality standards. This will be identified in your crosswalk as well. Now, getting into the 500 series, repetitive loss. This is the second of the two activities required to get into and stay in the program. If you have no rep loss properties, great, no action is needed. If you have one or more in your community, you'll need to determine the cause of flooding for each and create or map rep loss areas for those buildings affected by the same cause of flooding that are close to each other. You'll also need to submit a map of those rep loss areas. An example is shown on the right side of the screen. The CCRL form on the left will need to be filled out and signed. Your CRS specialist can assist you with that. We have a model outreach letter on our website that you can customize for your situation, and we'll need a copy of the mailing list of everyone that it went to in your rep loss areas, as seen on the right. For the rest of the 500 series, we get into planning. If you have 50 or more rep loss properties, you'll be required to have a hazard mitigation plan, or a floodplain management plan, or a rep loss area analysis. You'll need to submit at least one of those to be scored along with the annual progress report. Acquisition and relocation is generally for buyouts. We'll need to see a map or address list for properties you've bought out, along with the deeds to show they'll remain open space. If you can't buy out flood-prone properties, maybe you can protect them in place. This is Activity 530. Elevation projects, sewer backup protection, wet floodproofing, channel diversions, or structural projects are some examples of credited mitigation in Activity 530. Based on the type of flood protection, your specialist will provide guidance on what type of documentation is needed. Besides your specialist, the crosswalk and the manual are always your key sources of help as you're preparing your documentation. And lastly, the 600 series. If you have a flood warning and response plan, we'll need to see copies of those. And as with all plans, we'll need to see a copy of the adoption resolution as well. For levees and dams, we'll want your maintenance records, early warning procedures, and your dam or levee failure response protocols. Now let's talk about what happens after the visit. If you don't have all the documentation available for the meeting, you have 30 days after the visit to submit everything required. This is why it's a great idea to submit documentation ahead of time, because that month goes by fast and the 30-day deadline is strictly enforced. When you're submitting, be very clear about which activity number and element it relates to, and mark it clearly so we can find it easily. Once your specialist has reviewed and scored everything, you'll get a verification report showing all the activities you receive credit in. If you're entering CRS for the first time, or if you're changing classes, your new classification will become effective either May 1 or October 1. Keep in mind, FEMA needs to know your classification about 6 to 7 months ahead of these dates, Just know that it takes some time to get everything into the flood insurance manual to see a change. And finally, let's go over some tips and tricks for a successful visit. Start a folder or some kind of organizational system for each of the 19 activities, and throughout the year, as you complete something, put it in the folder. That way you're not having to wrangle it all together at the last minute. Identify if there's other staff that needs to be involved in visit preparation or needs to attend the meeting, especially a GIS person who's useful for activities 420, 440, 450, and 501, where you'll need mapping. Make copies of everything you submit to your specialist in case something gets lost or there's a question. For future years, you can use that as a guide for what you'll be submitting. Conduct your CRS activities throughout the year. Don't wait until the last second. Go look at our Activity 310 Permit List template. If you can switch over and use it going forward, that's great. If you have your own tracking system, that's also fine. Just make sure that your tracking system keeps the same information that we want. You can find that template on our website. If you're not quite up to speed with the newest manual, start familiarizing yourself with it and what's required, and start documenting things that way. For the meeting itself, try reserving a conference room for the day, with a large table where you can spread out the maps and documentation that'll be reviewed during the visit. Try to have an electrical outlet available nearby. Your CRS specialist will come with their computer and will need to plug in. Do your best to limit any phone calls or walk-ins and other interruptions so that you can focus on your CRS visit that day. Manage your expectations. Know whether you're trying for a class improvement or are you just trying to maintain your class during the visit. Understand the timeline of the cycle visit from start to finish. We've gone through all that in this training module, so you should have a good feeling for that now. There may be some field verification needed. Your CRS specialist may need to drive around your community and view things after the meeting. You may want to ask ahead of time in case you need to reserve a car or if other people involved in the visit would also like to attend. This brings us to the end of the Verification Visit training module. Thank you for watching. More information and training is available at our website, crsresources.org.